Now, European leaders are also warning U.S. President-elect Donald Trump not to invade other countries after he returns to office later this month. Trump has said he wants the U.S. to take control of Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal. He also announced that he would be changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico.
Donald Trump has yet to take over the White House, but already he's setting his sights much further.
We're going to be changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, which has a beautiful ring that covers a lot of territory. The Gulf of America, what a beautiful name. And it's appropriate. It's appropriate.
Trump's statement did not come with any explanation about how or why he planned to change the name. It's just the latest in a string of claims he's made about US expansionism. In addition to the Gulf of Mexico, he's also set his sights on the Panama Canal, claiming the US will take control of the crucial shipping lane. Canada is also on Trump's wish list. He wants to absorb the northern neighbour. And Greenland, the resource-rich Danish territory, is also in his sights. His son, Donald Trump Jr., touched down in Greenland's capital Nuuk this week, supposedly on a tourist visit. Denmark's Prime Minister says Greenland's future is for Greenland's people to decide.
As a very close ally to the US, there is a reason to be pleased with their growing interest, but it has to take place in a way that is respectful towards the population of Greenland.
Other leaders have been more blunt. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says there isn't a snowball's chance in hell of Canada becoming part of the US. And Panama's leaders say their canal will remain Panamanian.
Our canal's sovereignty is not negotiable and is part of our history of struggle and an irreversible conquest.
But Donald Trump does not appear to be deterred. Speaking to reporters, he refused to rule out using military or economic action to take control of the Panama Canal or Greenland. His bid for growing global reach seemingly escalating ahead of his inauguration in less than 2 weeks.
Well, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says EU leaders are baffled after U.S. President-elect Donald Trump refused to rule out military action to gain control of Greenland.
The principle of the inviolability of borders applies to every country, whether it lies east or west of us. Every state must adhere to it, whether it is a small country or a very powerful state. It is a fundamental principle of international law and a core element of what we call Western values. There can and must be no compromise on this.
Let's bring in DW correspondent Simon Young in Berlin for more on this. Simon, good to see you. Trump's remarks, of course, setting off alarm bells across European capitals. We've just heard the German chancellor there. Does the German government really think that Trump will follow through on his words?
Claire, it's pretty hard to say. I mean, Olaf Scholz didn't mention Donald Trump by name. He just said that he and some other European leaders that he's been speaking to felt uneasiness about statements coming out of the US recently. And what he did was refer to the Helsinki Accords. Those were the Cold War era agreements that were intended to sort of reduce tensions between the Soviet bloc and the West, and in particular the key provision that borders should not be changed by force. And indeed, Scholz began his statement by referring to Russia's war in Ukraine and pointing out that it's a violation of international law. So I think it's pretty clear that what the German government's really worried about is the idea that these remarks by Trump somehow undermine the main argument of the West in regards to the Ukraine war, namely that Russia's invasion is illegal. So I doubt whether the German government necessarily thinks that Donald Trump is going to invade anywhere. The point is that he appears, at any rate, to be questioning the principle.
Now, Germany, of course, is set to hold fresh elections coming up in February. According to the latest polls, Chancellor Scholz, who we heard just there, is going to be out as chancellor. Are there indications already of how a future Germany going ahead into 2025 might handle the incoming Trump administration?
Well, I think it's certainly going to be a rough ride. It rather depends, of course, what comes out of Trump's White House, how many challenges he throws out. A lot of focus, I think, will have to be on maintaining the traditionally good relationship between Germany and the US, but also there'll be a need for, adequate reaction to any sort of challenges, and in particular also keeping the European nations together. And if Trump, for instance, pulls back on support for Ukraine, that will mean a headache for Germany and the other European allies that Kiev has. Or on trade, Donald Trump talks about trade wars and his liking for tariffs, particularly on German cars. But politicians here, like the economy minister, Robert Habeck, say, well, no, we can stand up to Donald Trump as long as the European countries stick together. And, of course, he points out, a lot of so-called German cars are actually manufactured in the United States, and a lot of US jobs depend on them as well.
All right. Well, thank you, as always, for the analysis. That's DW's Simon Young.
And we can speak now to Benjamin Tallis, who's the director of the Democratic Strategy Initiative and the author of a new book on German and European security. Good to see you, Benjamin. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, following all of these remarks that Trump has made, several EU leaders have been very clear in their criticism, making it clear that the EU won't let other countries attack their sovereign borders. If Trump really were to put his words into action, how do you see the European Union responding?
Well, good afternoon, and a pleasure to be back with you. First of all, it's important to emphasize that we don't know how Donald Trump would act. We don't know that he would necessarily turn any of these words into action. So it's important not to overreact before we actually know what would really happen. But it does indicate a really significant potential departure in US policy if Trump were to enact these words. And it would be a sad time for the US. It would be a sad time for the democratic world and for the NATO alliance, as well as for the European Union. The question then comes, what could the European Union and its member states actually do about this? And that really highlights the problem of having made ourselves considerably dependent upon the United States for our security. There's nothing wrong with being good allies, but that means really paying your way and doing your share. And that's where Europeans and Canadians have been rather delinquent. So we've left ourselves without the true capabilities to stand up for ourselves, with the couple of exceptions of perhaps France and UK with nuclear weapons, although God forbid it should come to that state of affairs.
France has denounced Trump's remarks as a form of imperialism. What do you make of that assessment?
It's a very frank statement, and honestly, I think it's fairly accurate. The way that Donald Trump has been talking about the territories surrounding the US, here, Canada, and close to the US in Greenland, is rather reminiscent of the way Russian leaders and Russian propagandists have talked about Ukraine and talked about their own near abroad. And again, this would be a truly sad departure for the United States were Trump to enact that, because it does rather look like a form of might makes right, of anti-democratic imperial thinking.
You've made very clear that we don't know what Donald Trump will do. However, what would you say European countries need to do? How do they need to adapt in order to maintain a working alliance with the US with this kind of rhetoric in the background?
Well, interestingly, the challenge for Europe actually remains largely the same. The strategic challenge, that is, Europe needs to get its own house in order on defense. It needs to spend more on defense and procure the kind of capabilities that would allow us to properly defend ourselves and play our correct part in the NATO alliance. That hasn't changed as a result of Donald Trump's election. It hasn't changed as a result of these remarks. And moreover, Europe's economic situation, dependency on China, for example, that hasn't changed as a result of these remarks. remarks either. Our strategic challenge has remained clear. The circumstance in which we have to try and meet it is what is potentially changing. But I find it interesting and a little regretful that some people have spoken since Trump's remarks about a wake-up call or about plunging Europe into chaos with these calls for 5% defense spending. If this is what it took to plunge you into chaos, you haven't been paying attention for the last 3 years. So actually, ultimately, our challenge remains the same.
And how do you see Trump's rhetoric affecting the EU's economy as well as politics within the bloc? Because it seems to me that there's never been more of a need for unity right now.
Well, unity as such is overrated. Because it depends unity around which position. If it's unity around a position of weakness and capitulation to Russia, for example, that's no good. If it's unity around strength, about standing up for our values, defending ourselves, that's the kind of unity that we could use.
But in France and Germany, there's open concern about Donald Trump's apparent threat to the EU's sovereignty. The French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot said the EU had to defend itself better against, quote, attacks on its sovereign borders. And this was the reaction from the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
In my discussions with our European partners, a certain incomprehension has become clear when it comes to current statements from the United States. The principle of inviolable borders applies to every country, regardless of whether it's to the east or west of us. And every country must abide by this principle, regardless of whether it's a small country or a powerful state.
So to unpack all of that, I would like to welcome Kristine Berzina, the Managing Director of the GMF's Geostrategy North program, with a focus on U.S. and Arctic defense and security. She's joining us today from Washington, D.C. Welcome. I'd like to start by asking you for your reaction to these comments. How seriously do you think Trump would pursue these threats, if at all?
The fact that we are hearing about Trump's interest in Greenland and concern over Arctic security again in advance of him coming in for a second time indicates that his first term's interest in purchasing Greenland wasn't a passing fad. It wasn't just a glimmer. In fact, Trump seems to have an interest in particular in the Arctic and in the high north. A lot of that seems to make sense. When you look at the way that Russia has been increasing investments in its own Arctic defenses, despite the war, Russia has been making sure that its nuclear fleets and its Arctic capabilities are stronger. It is cooperating more with China, giving more over to China for development in the Arctic. These are big concerns for the United States, which has an Arctic country in and of itself. The problem, of course, is the rhetoric and the approach. It would be perfectly reasonable for the United States to work with the other non-Russian NATO allies to have deeper cooperation, capabilities development, the development of essential resources, the raw materials, the critical materials that are in Greenland for the benefit of the democracies that are all partners and allies. The approach, though, of threatening to purchase or to try to coerce Denmark into giving over territory, these pressure that is put on Mexico and on Panama is very much contrary to the position and the values that the U.S. has taken in the past. The U.S. has had a very strong attractive force. The U.S. has respected and stood up for small countries, for people, for their rights and for sovereignty and self-determination. And that is not what we're hearing in the approach that Trump is taking. And to not rule out military force for these objectives, when it comes to NATO allies, it is especially remarkable. So again, there's a conflict between legitimate concerns that could be addressed very productively, collaboratively, and a unilateral and intimidation-based approach that Trump seems to be taking.
Now, it is that apparent threat of military force that has alarm bells ringing in the EU especially. What would happen if the U.S. were to attack Greenland? And just to give us a bit more context, how much of a geostrategic vulnerability is Greenland for the United States?
So we're looking here at long-term strategic trends. There is no imminent threat to the United States coming from or near Greenland. When you think about Greenland, Greenland is important because of where it is between North America and Europe, and the passageway between Greenland and Norway. If you the map is a great illustration there. So there's the GI-UK gap, which you talk about in the foreign policy terms. So Greenland, Iceland, UK, Norway. The gap between these countries in the North Atlantic is also the way that Russia is able to get its northern fleet, its nuclear submarines, down from the Kola Peninsula and into the Atlantic. Russia considers this to be its major strategic need, a vulnerability if that is closed off. And also, in case of a larger conflict with Russia, for the North Americans to reinforce Europe, there would need to be transit across this gap, across the Atlantic. So the need to be able to control the seaway or to have access to it or to prevent Russia from cutting it off has been a preoccupation since World War II and before. This is a very important long-term strategic need, but that is different from an imminent national security concern. What would make sense for the U.S. is to build upon its existing bases, which are in the north of Greenland already, and to develop those capabilities further, let alone actually build icebreakers and other capabilities that the U.S. needs already in order to be stronger in the Arctic. But that is a very different conversation than the one that is currently being had about purchasing or coercing and to hand over territory, because the U.S. is in no position at the moment to even fully access or to assist in the defense of these high north and Arctic territories.
Indeed, it seems that's very much not the direction that the conversation is currently going. I'm curious, Greenland and Denmark's leaders have both reiterated that Greenland is not for sale. How much of a say does Greenland have in this?
Well, Greenland is a part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but it has its own self-governance and its own parliament. And as we saw right now, when the Danish officials are speaking and the Prime Minister is speaking about Greenland, the voices of, the say of Greenlanders and their future is paramount. This is a difference than from when the last time the U.S. offered to purchase Greenland before Trump came in. Right after World War II, President Truman offered Denmark the ability to sell Greenland to the United States, and that was rejected. Back in that day, it was still a colonial era across Europe, and that is really not the world we live in today. Today, the West in particular advocates for the rights of Greenlanders, as any other people in their states, to be sovereign, to have a say in the direction that their countries take. It is not for certain bigger countries to carve off and partake and give away territories of other people. It comes down to the individual themselves. And when we talk about Greenland, there is a historic vulnerability for indigenous groups across the world in the way that they have been pushed and coerced in the past. So because this conversation about Greenland is not just about Denmark itself, but already fits into a slightly more complicated dynamic. And Denmark is giving so much voice to the Greenlanders themselves. Mm-hmm. I think it is important to understand that even the rhetoric of trade and the red language of coercion fits into a very unwelcome historical rhetoric that harks back to a colonial era and is incredibly unwelcome globally, but also contrary to the interests of the United States and Europe. The global South in particular, as we think about more of this global competition between North America and Europe and China, Russia, the colonial past that Europe has had has been a big problem in that, and we should not create it again.
Well, thank you so much for providing all that context for us. That is Kristine Berzina from the German Marshall Fund.